For most of his life, Judge Charles Whitman lived by a strict code: truth, justice, and honor above all else. At 63, he was a towering figure in the legal world of Savannah, Georgia. Respected by prosecutors and defense attorneys alike, he had presided over some of the most high-profile cases in the state. People called him the Iron Gavel, not because he was cruel, but because he was unwavering. He believed in doing the right thing, even when it hurt. At his side for the past 30 years had been Elaine, his soft-spoken, elegant wife with silver-streaked hair and the kind of gentle Southern grace you'd expect from a woman raised in Charleston. She rarely appeared in public, but when she did, she smiled politely and let Charles have the spotlight. They were, by all accounts, the picture of a stable, loving, old-fashioned marriage. Before she was Elaine Whitman, the elegant, composed wife of a judge, she had been Elias Carter, a quiet boy from rural South Carolina who learned early on how to disappear inside his own skin. Elias was the middle child of a Baptist deacon and a seamstress. His father was a stern man, the kind whose belt hung not just from his pants, but from the memory of every mistake. His mother rarely spoke during dinner, except to say grace. In their house, God made no mistakes, and anything outside of his image was considered a sin. Elias knew he was different by the time he was 7. Not because he felt like a girl, exactly, but because when he imagined growing up, the future he saw didn't include becoming like his father or brothers. It included soft clothes, quiet rooms, and the sound of someone calling a name that wasn't his. By 12, he was stealing moments alone in his mother's closet. At 16, he was saving up lunch money to buy drugstore makeup and hiding it beneath loose floorboards. And at 17, after a brutal argument with his father over a skirt found in his backpack, Elias packed a duffel bag and left home with $30 and a bleeding lip. He lived in shelters, slept on buses, took jobs that paid under the table. It was a lonely life, but it was his. He didn't become Elaine overnight. There were years of confusion, years of shame. He saw therapists who tried to fix him, pastors who tried to scare him, and doctors who offered hormones behind locked doors with no explanations. But for the first time, he had agency. Every decision, every terrifying, hopeful step was his. By his mid-20s, the transition was complete. On paper, Elias Carter no longer existed. Elaine Carter was born not from deception, but from survival. There were relationships along the way, short, cautious ones, but they always ended the same, with silence. The truth was a wall too high, too risky, and too painful to scale. So she stopped trying. She chose solitude over heartbreak. Until Charles. They met at a courthouse event back in 1992. Charles had just been appointed to the bench, and Elaine was working in the administrative office at the time. There was an instant connection. She admired his dedication to law. He admired her poise and intellect. 6 months later, they were married in a quiet ceremony with only close family present. Their life was simple, structured, and elegant. They lived in a colonial-style home with tall shutters and ivy growing up the walls. They didn't have children, but no one ever questioned it. Some said they chose career over family. Others simply assumed it was a private matter. And in a place like Savannah, folks rarely pried. Every Sunday, they sat together at the front row of St. Paul's Episcopal Church. Charles in his crisp navy suit, Elaine in soft pastels and pearls. They hosted annual Christmas dinners, donated to the local shelter, and always sent handwritten thank you notes. For decades, their marriage was held up as an example of quiet devotion and mutual respect. As Charles approached retirement, people whispered about the legacy he would leave. One of the last real men of principle, his colleague once said. Elaine smiled quietly whenever someone complimented her husband, proud, supportive, and content to remain in his shadow. To outsiders, their world seemed unshakable. But as we all know, some of the deepest cracks lie just beneath the surface. It all began with a letter. One afternoon in early spring, Charles received an envelope marked with the name of his late uncle, Thomas Whitman, a reclusive World War II veteran who'd recently passed away in Virginia. The letter was from a law firm, informing Charles that he had been named in the will. But there was a condition. He would need to provide a DNA sample to verify lineage. It wasn't unusual. The estate was sizable, and several relatives had come forward claiming to be heirs. Charles chuckled when he read it. They don't trust a judge, but they'll trust a cotton swab, he joked to Elaine. She smiled, slightly uneasy. A week later, the two of them sat at the kitchen table, filling out paperwork and sealing saliva swabs in plastic tubes. Elaine hesitated, then offered hers without protest. They probably just want to confirm we're married, she said softly. Charles didn't think twice. 3 weeks passed, and then the phone call came, not from the law firm, but from the testing lab. The voice on the other end was quiet, cautious. They asked to verify some information. There had been a discrepancy in one of the samples. The one marked Elaine Whitman, the technician said, appears to be genetically male. Charles froze. He sat there, staring out the window as his hand tightened around the phone. He thought it was a mistake. Some lab tech must have switched the labels. It happens, right? But the voice on the phone was firm. We double-checked. The sample is accurate. Still, Charles didn't confront Elaine right away. For 3 days, he barely spoke a word at home. He went to work. He ruled on cases. He smiled in public. But something inside him had cracked, a silent, growing rupture. On the 4th day, he searched their fireproof lockbox, the one where they kept birth certificates, marriage licenses, and passports. His hands trembled. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe something to prove the lab was wrong. Instead, he found an old document tucked between expired insurance papers. It was a court order, dated 1988. The name printed at the top read, Elias Carter, petition for legal name and gender change. Charles couldn't breathe. For 30 years, he had loved this woman, trusted her, shared his bed, his prayers, his life. And now, he didn't know who she was. He sat in his study, alone, surrounded by law books and framed photos of a life he thought he understood. The gavel on his desk suddenly felt like a joke. He, of all people, a man who sentenced liars, frauds, and manipulators, had been living a lie of his own. The silence in the house that night was deafening. And Elaine? She knew something had changed. The way Charles looked at her, the way he didn't, it was all different. But she didn't ask. Not yet. She just placed his dinner plate gently on the table and whispered, "You okay, love?" He didn't answer. The next evening, it rained. Not a soft southern drizzle, but a hard, steady downpour that rattled the windows and filled the gutters like they were about to overflow. Charles sat in his armchair, scotch in hand, the fire untouched in the hearth. Elaine stood in the doorway of the study, holding a folded sweater. "You're cold," she said gently. "You didn't light the fire." He didn't look up. "Sit down, Elaine." Something in his voice stopped her. She placed the sweater over the back of the couch and walked slowly to the chair across from him. The lamp cast a soft golden glow between them. Outside, thunder rolled like a drumbeat from another world. "I need to ask you something," Charles said, "and I want the truth." Elaine nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "Who is Elias Carter?" She didn't flinch. Her eyes welled for a second, not with panic, not with fear, but with a quiet, weary sadness. The kind that builds up over years of knowing a storm like this would one day come. "I was Elias," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "A long time ago." Silence. Charles stared at her like she was a stranger, as if 30 years of shared memories had vanished in an instant. The holidays, the anniversaries, the prayers they said before dinner, all crumbling like ash between his fingers. "You lied to me," he said, "for 3 decades. I never lied about loving you," Elaine said, her voice cracking. "That was always real. You let me go my whole life, my career, my faith, my reputation, while you kept this from me," he snapped, rising from his chair. "Do you know what that makes me look like?" "What makes me?" "I was afraid," she said softly. "Afraid you'd leave. Or worse." Charles began pacing the room, the veins in his neck standing out like cords. He wasn't a man given to outbursts, but this was betrayal on a level he couldn't comprehend. "I sentenced people to life in prison for fraud. I lectured men for hiding things from their wives. I stood in front of a congregation every Sunday and talked about morality. And all the while," he stopped, pointing a shaking finger at her, "you made me a fool." Elaine stood slowly. "I never meant to deceive you. I thought if I told you, you'd never see me the same way again." "You were right." Those words landed like a punch. That night, long after Elaine had retreated upstairs in silence, Charles drove through the rain to St. Paul's Episcopal Church, the same church where they had sat together every Sunday for nearly 3 decades. It was past midnight. The sanctuary was dark, empty, but the door was unlocked, as it always was in Savannah for those in need of prayer. Charles stepped inside, soaked to the bone, and collapsed onto the front pew. He didn't light a candle. He didn't speak. He just sat, staring at the altar where he had once bowed his head with unwavering conviction. For most of his life, faith had been his anchor, justice his compass. Together, they made him who he was, a man of integrity, of absolutes. But now, everything felt like a riddle without an answer. What did it mean to be deceived by the one person you trusted most? What did it say about the vows he made, the sermons he praised, the judgments he passed? Worse, what did it say about him? In that quiet church, Charles remembered a case from 10 years prior. A young trans woman, accused of fraud, had stood trembling before his bench. He had been firm, stern, spoke about honesty and biological facts. He sentenced her to 2 years and felt no remorse. Now, he couldn't even meet his own eyes in the reflection of the stained glass window. Was he a hypocrite? A fool? A victim? He didn't know. The silence around him wasn't peaceful anymore. It was accusing, condemning. And for the first time in his life, Charles Whitman, the iron gavel, didn't know what was right. He left before dawn, the pew cushions still damp from his coat, and his heart heavier than the rain clouds above Savannah. For the first time, Elaine's shoulders slumped. Her eyes drifted to the framed wedding photo on the bookshelf. A younger Charles, proud, hopeful, standing next to the woman he thought he knew. "I loved you," she whispered. "I still do." But Charles didn't respond. He walked to the liquor cabinet, poured another glass of scotch with trembling hands, and stared into the fireplace, still dark, still cold. When Elaine reached out to touch his shoulder, he flinched away. "I need time," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "I need to figure out who I am, now that I know who you really are." Elaine stood frozen in the center of the room, rain thundering outside, a marriage unraveling around her, thread by painful thread. Neither of them knew it then, but that would be the last full conversation they would ever have. It was a Thursday night, 6 days after the truth came out, when everything fell apart. The rain hadn't stopped since morning. A heavy storm blanketed Savannah, turning streets into shallow rivers and smearing the sky with bruised, gray clouds. In the Whitman home, the lights were dim, the air still like something was holding its breath. Charles sat alone in the study, suit jacket off, sleeves rolled up. On his desk sat 2 things, a copy of their marriage license and the court order changing Elias Carter into Elaine Whitman.
His eyes flicked between them like he was trying to decide which one told the real story. In his hand was his father's old revolver, a Colt .38, polished and worn, passed down like a family heirloom. He hadn't touched it in years. Now it felt heavy in his palm, as if it somehow understood the weight of what he was about to do. Upstairs, Elaine was packing a small bag. She had decided she'd leave the next morning. She didn't know where she would go, only that she had to leave, to give Charles space, maybe even peace. She paused beside the bed, staring at a photo on the nightstand. Them at Lake Oconee, laughing on a boat, sun in their hair. A time before secrets, before DNA tests, before shame. Then a sound. The unmistakable click of a hammer being drawn back. She turned toward the stairs. And then a gunshot. It echoed through the house like thunder inside a cave. Elaine ran. Barefoot, heart pounding, she raced down the stairs and burst into the study. Charles was still standing, but his hand trembled, the gun aimed now at her. "I don't know what's real anymore," he said, voice breaking. "I don't even know who I am." "Please," she said, hands raised. "Put it down. I gave you my whole life," he choked. "I built everything on trust and truth. And you took that from me. I was trying to protect you," she whispered. "From a truth." He laughed, bitter, empty. "No, you were protecting yourself." And then the second shot. The bullet hit Elaine just below the collarbone. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to the warm bloom of blood spreading across her blouse. She crumpled near the hallway, gasping. Charles stood frozen, breathing heavily, gun still in hand. The study was silent now, except for the rain lashing against the windows and Elaine's ragged breaths. Then, he turned the gun on himself. Neighbors would later say they heard the third shot. Loud, final, followed by an eerie silence. It was Mrs. Gordon, their next-door neighbor, who called 911 after hearing what she thought was fireworks. When the paramedics arrived 15 minutes later, they found Charles slumped in his armchair, a pool of blood beneath him. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Elaine, barely conscious and slipping in and out of shock, was rushed to Memorial Health Medical Center. The bullet had missed her heart by less than an inch. She survived, but in many ways, that night, both of them died. Elaine woke up 3 days later in the ICU. Her chest burned with every breath, bandages bound tight around her shoulder. A nurse was adjusting her when she opened her eyes. The room was cold, too clean, too quiet. It took her a moment to remember where she was and why. Then the memory hit her like a wave. Charles, the gun, the look in his eyes, and the sound of that second shot. She didn't cry. Not then. Not when the doctors spoke in soft voices about recovery. Not when the detective asked her to recount the events of that night. Not even when they handed her a small plastic bag containing her blood-stained wedding ring and Charles's pocket Bible. But that night, alone in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, she wept. She wept for the man she had loved. She wept for the life they had built. And she wept for the truth she had waited too long to share. But healing wasn't just physical. The bullet had missed her heart, but it had shattered something deeper, something no doctor could stitch back together. During her second week in the hospital, a psychiatrist came to speak with her. A soft-spoken man named Dr. Klein. He wore round glasses and always brought a notepad he rarely wrote on. "I'm not here to judge," he said gently, "only to listen." Elaine said very little. She mentioned a shooting only in fragments. He was standing there, the gun was shaking. I saw it coming, but not once did she say Charles's name aloud. She couldn't. Not yet. What haunted her most wasn't the pain. It was the look on his face. Not rage. Not even betrayal. Just loss. As if he'd already buried the woman he thought she was before the gun ever went off. After she was discharged, the hospital referred her to a trauma counselor. For weeks, she sat across from another therapist in a room with watercolor paintings and artificial plants, answering questions she barely heard. Do you feel safe? Do you have nightmares? Do you feel guilt? Yes, yes, and yes. The nightmares came in waves. Sometimes it was the sound of the hammer cocking. Sometimes it was her name, Elias, echoing like a curse through a courtroom. Sometimes she dreamed of Charles, younger, smiling, until his face melted into disappointment. She stopped answering calls, stopped opening letters. She told the local paper to stop using her name. She didn't want pity or outrage. She didn't want to defend herself. She just wanted to disappear. Some nights, she would stare at the pill bottles on her nightstand longer than she meant to. Not out of intent, but out of exhaustion. She wasn't suicidal. She was just tired. Tired of being a symbol, a scandal, a survivor. All she wanted was to be someone ordinary, someone no one ever had to Google. So she left Savannah behind, and she buried Elaine Whitman with her husband. The news spread fast. Prominent Georgia judge dies in domestic shooting. Wife survives apparent murder-suicide attempt. And eventually, judge kills wife after discovering her transgender identity. They splashed her face across the news. Talk show panels dissected her life. Was she a deceiver? A victim? A criminal? A tragic symbol? The internet had opinions. Everyone did. But Elaine stayed silent. She declined interviews, refused comment. She didn't want to be a symbol or a headline. She just wanted to disappear. After she was discharged from the hospital, Elaine sold the house in Savannah. She didn't pack much, just a suitcase, a photo album, and the ashes of a man who had once loved her more than anything in the world. She moved to a small town near the Carolina coast, under a different name, Anna Carter. No one there knew her story. She didn't speak of the past. She rented a modest cottage with blue shutters and salt in the air. And for the first time in decades, she was alone. Utterly, heartbreakingly alone. Each day became a ritual of survival. She volunteered quietly at a food pantry. She kept to herself at church. She cooked for one. There were no more Christmas dinners, no more anniversaries to celebrate. Only the empty space at the table, the one that used to belong to Charles. And though she had been the one who lived, sometimes she wondered if she had truly survived. 2 weeks before the anniversary of Charles's death, while cleaning out a box of old books in the closet, Anna found something she wasn't expecting. It was tucked inside the back cover of his pocket Bible, the same one the police had returned to her in a clear evidence bag after the shooting. She had never opened it, couldn't bear to, until that day. A single sheet of hotel stationery had been folded in quarters, yellowed and delicate, written in Charles's hand. Unmistakable, sharp, precise, were only a few paragraphs, unfinished. It wasn't addressed to her. It didn't say, "Dear Elaine." It didn't say anything formal. It began like a confession. I don't know if I'll ever give this to you, but I need to say it, even if only to paper. I've been sitting here for hours, trying to figure out whether what I feel is anger or grief. The truth is, it's both. You broke something in me, but I also know I loved you more deeply than I've ever loved anyone in this life. Anna's fingers trembled as she turned the page over. There was more, scribbled, less certain. I keep trying to remember what was fake and what was real. I look at the wedding photos, the Christmas cards, the way you used to fall asleep during Matlock reruns. And all I can think is, how could someone who lied to me also be the person who held me every night? And then I think, maybe the lie wasn't in what you hid. Maybe the lie is what I told myself about what love is supposed to look like. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I'm more afraid that I won't know how to forgive myself. The letter stopped there. No signature, no date, just the imprint of a pen that had pressed down hard, as if the writer had kneaded the page to feel the weight of every word. Anna pressed the paper to her chest and wept. Not like she had after the shooting, not like she had in the ICU. This time it was different. This time she wept not just for loss, but for the possibility that, even in his pain, Charles had still been searching for a way back to her. On the first anniversary of his death, she returned to Savannah, not to see anyone, just to visit the cemetery. She placed a single white rose on his grave and whispered through trembling lips. "You said I took everything from you, but I never wanted to take you. I only wanted to be loved and to love you back. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She didn't stay long, just enough to say goodbye. Again, the years passed, quietly, slowly, almost like a penance. Elaine, now living as Anna Carter, kept a routine so simple it was almost invisible. Mornings at the corner cafe, afternoons at the library or volunteering at the local food shelf, and evenings in the same little seaside cottage where the wind rattled the shutters just enough to remind her she wasn't completely alone. In town, people knew her as Ms. Anna, the soft-spoken older woman with kind eyes and too many scarves. She always smiled, always thanked the cashier, always returned books on time. If she ever felt lonely, no one asked. And if she had a past, no one pressed. But she never really belonged. She didn't decorate for holidays. She never joined the book club. And she always left church just before the final hymn. Some days she would catch her own reflection in the window and almost not recognize the woman staring back, silver-haired, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken regrets. She had survived something most people couldn't imagine, and yet she never once described herself as a survivor. To survive meant to move on. Elaine hadn't. There was one young woman, Melissa, a nurse in her 30s who worked part-time at the clinic, who took a gentle interest in Anna. She started small, dropping off soup when Anna had the flu, offering to carry groceries, stopping by with a used book she thought Anna might like. At first, Anna resisted the connection. She didn't want kindness that might turn into curiosity. But Melissa never pried, never asked about the missing ring on Anna's finger or the way she sometimes drifted into silence in the middle of a sentence. Over time, a quiet friendship formed. One evening, after sharing tea by candlelight during a power outage, Melissa asked, "Do you believe people can ever truly forgive themselves?" Anna stared at the flame for a long while before answering. "Some things," she said softly, "we don't get to forgive. We just learn how to carry them." Despite Melissa's warmth, Anna never fully opened up. She couldn't. Instead, she poured her sorrow into small acts of redemption, helping a struggling mother at the food pantry, donating anonymously to scholarships for LGBTQ students, leaving fresh flowers at the cemetery each spring for a man whose name she never spoke aloud again. She didn't try to explain herself. She didn't believe she could. And yet, there were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, when she would sit by the sea and remember what it felt like to be loved. Truly loved. Before secrets, before shame, before the storm. She would close her eyes and pretend Charles was still beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. The silence between them no longer a wound, but a kind of peace. In those moments, she didn't feel judged, or guilty, or erased. She just felt human. On a warm October morning, 7 years after the shooting, Anna Carter rose before dawn. She moved slower these days. Her bones ached when the temperature dropped, and her memory sometimes danced just out of reach. But this day, she never forgot. It was Charles's birthday. She dressed in a simple gray cardigan, pinned a delicate cross to her collar, and tucked a single white rose into her purse. The trip to Savannah took 4 hours by bus. She sat by the window the whole way, watching the world go by in silence, her reflection faint in the glass. a woman shaped by time, secrets, and sorrow. When she arrived at the cemetery, the sky had turned overcast. A breeze whispered through the rows of headstones, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. She found his grave easily. She always did. Judge Charles Whitman, 1949 to 2019. A man of principle. She knelt beside it, careful with her knees, and gently laid the rose across the base of the stone. Then, slowly, she spoke, not loudly, not with ceremony, but as if continuing a conversation that had never really ended. They still say your name with reverence, and I still carry your voice in my dreams. You died never knowing everything, but I died knowing I loved you. And maybe that's the cruelest truth of all. A tear slid down her cheek, not of grief, but of exhaustion from years of silence, of exile, of being both remembered and erased. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded photo, yellowed at the edges. It showed them sitting on a porch swing sometime in the late 90s. His arm was around her. Her head rested on his shoulder. They were smiling. No masks, no lies, just a moment when love felt safe. She placed the photo under the rose. Then she whispered 3 final words. "Forgive me, Charles." She didn't expect an answer, and none came. That was the last time anyone saw Anna Carter in Savannah. A few years later, Melissa, the young nurse, received a package with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter and the deed to Anna's cottage by the sea. In the letter, Anna had written, "I live a life between truth and fear. If this home can shelter someone who needs a second chance, let it. Let be a place where no one has to hide." Melissa turned it into a transitional home for LGBTQ youth. And so, long after she was gone, Elaine Whitman, once Elias Carter, once Anna Carter, found a way to offer the one thing she had always longed for herself. A place to be seen, a place to be safe, a place to be forgiven. 2 years after Anna Carter passed away quietly in her sleep, the small cottage by the sea welcomed its first new resident. His name was Jalen Rivers, a 19-year-old boy with a shy smile and a suitcase that held more pain than belongings. He had been kicked out of his home after coming out as transgender, sleeping in his car for weeks, skipping meals, and praying each night that he'd make it to the next morning. Melissa, now running the transitional home in Anna's memory, met him at the clinic one rainy afternoon. He had come in with a bruised rib and a cough he couldn't shake. She offered him soup, then shelter. When she handed him the keys to the blue-shuttered cottage, he cried. "It's not much," Melissa said, "but it's safe." It was meant to be. The walls inside still bore faint traces of Anna's presence. A worn quilt on the bed, a shelf of poetry books, and one photo on the mantel. A porch swing, a man and woman smiling at each other like the world didn't owe them any explanation. Jalen never asked who they were. But one night, as he unpacked a box labeled letters and keepsakes, he found a thin journal tied with twine. Inside, written in gentle script, was a single passage on the first page. "I lived between truth and fear for most of my life, but I still believe that love, even when hidden, even when lost, leaves something behind. If this home can be the start of someone else's truth, let it. Let them never have to choose between who they are and being loved." Jalen read it again and again. Then he closed the journal, placed it on the nightstand, and lay back in the bed, the first real bed he'd slept in months. That night, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't dream of running. He dreamed of staying. If you found this story captivating, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. We post gripping true crime stories every day.